Now, a lot of this document deals with sustainability and development of land, being that so-called blacks in this country have been displaced from their land. Implementation of or us being able to see ourselves in some of that might be a little obscure. But what the document does do is it points to the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, otherwise known as the DRIP, which we'll be going into briefly. But first, let's go back to Wikipedia because it has an interesting section on U.S. opposition. Now, the U.S. does recognize this. It says, the United States is a signatory country to Agenda 21. But because Agenda 21 is a legally non-binding statement of intent and not a treaty, the United States was not required to hold formal debates or vote on it. It is therefore not considered to be law under Article 6 of the United States Constitution. President George H.W. Bush was one of 178 heads of government who signed the final text of agreement at the Earth Summit in 1992. And in the same year, Representatives Nancy Pelosi, Eliot Engel, and William Bloomfield spoke in support of the United States House of Representatives Concurrent Resolution 353 supporting implementation of Agenda 21 in the United States. However, during the last decade, opposition to Agenda 21 has increased within the United States at local, state, and federal levels. The Republican National Party has adopted a resolution opposing Agenda 21, and the Republican Party platform stated that we strongly reject the UN Agenda 21 as erosive of American sovereignty. American sovereignty. Let's understand this properly. What they call American sovereignty is not real sovereignty, because the United States corporation usurped this land, and this is historically proven. There have been many treaties that have been violated, much threat, duress, and coercion, usurpation of lands, removing people off of lands, genocide, so on and so forth. So we don't have to go into this today. But the reason that there's opposition is because if they recognize these things, then the very land that they usurped, they would have to turn back over to the indigenous population to manage for themselves. Now, many of us that have Native American heritage have been defrauded of that heritage by the placing of labels such as black, Negro, colored, and let's make no mistake. My grandmother's birth certificate has mulatto on it. Let's not forget they have mulatto, Sambo, Quadroon, Octoquadroon, all of these mythical races. So when I say that black is a caste label, it shouldn't be that hard to understand, because they've been using labels and not titles, but labels like this on birth certificate to defraud so-called blacks of their indigenous rights, indigenous land, and resources. And one should look into one of the landmark cases, Queen Verdi's Godson Ilbay, who actually sued the federal government and got, I think it was about 60,000 acres of the Louisiana Purchase back, because she was able to show through land grants and documentation of indigenous heritage. And they don't want you to know about these cases, because if you start digging deep enough into your heritage, you might be up for one of these type of suits. So now when we turn our attention to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 1, it states, indigenous people have the right to the full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and International Human Rights Law. Article 2, indigenous people and individuals are free and equal to all other peoples and individuals and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of their rights, in particular that's based on the indigenous origin or identity. Article 3, Indigenous people have the right to self-determination. Self-determination. Power to determine one's own destiny. Sound familiar? Black Panther Party want the freedom and power to determine our own destiny. Indigenous people have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they are free to determine their political status and free to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Political status. See, this is where the term so-called black comes in, because black is a political status. It means that you are the domestic property of the U.S. corporation. And this is proven in the Dred Scott case. If you're not familiar with the Dred Scott case, look it up. Nothing has changed. Last show, we brought up the fact that so-called blacks have to have their voting rights renewed every 25 years. It was renewed by Reagan. It was renewed by Bush. So look into it. Now, if you are a first-class citizen, and if you're not a second-class citizen, which is a caste slave, then why must your voting rights, excuse me, be renewed every 25 years? If you were a full citizen, this would not have to be done. No one else has to do it. And it is because of this reclassification, that so-called blacks are unaware of their true nationality and their true indigenous heritage.